And it's all right. We're recording.
Okay, welcome to our group's presentation on gamification. Get your students game on. This is Brittany Jolly, James Bearden, and Justin Furnell. I hope I pronounced all of those correctly. If I didn't, jump in. And hopefully by the end of today, you will learn a little bit more about gamification and how it can be applicable in your classroom, along with taking a look at some of the pros and cons of gamification. And with that said, we are going to be using a Nearpod platform. And so I'm going to pass it over to Justin to get us started.
All right. Okay, James, go ahead.
Okay, current education. Traditional aspects of classroom interactions without gamification. 1, face-to-face mentoring. 2, scheduled times for lectures and activities. 3, fixed location. 4, classroom management strategies utilized. 5, social stimulation. 6, technology can be used but not necessarily required. 21st century classrooms utilizing gamification. 1, technology integration. 2, highly collaborative environment. 3, opportunities for creative expression. 4, inquiry-based approach. 5, justification for answers. 6, reflection. 7, problem solving. 8, hands-on. 9, teacher as facilitator. 10, portfolios, rubrics, and formative assessment. Justin?
All right, so with the differences between like modern and 21st century classrooms, with the traditional classrooms, you don't see a whole lot of these 21st century skills, which gamification really utilizes those 21st century skills in the classroom. And because of gamification and the use of these 21st century skills, we can see a growth in our classrooms, both in participation, attendance, grades, and behavior. So what exactly is gamification? Gamification, as defined by dictionary.com, is the process of turning an activity or task into a game or something resembling a game. So this can be web apps that are used by the teacher. This can be programs. It can actually be traditional board games, things like that. And we have a list that I'm going to go through and some resources and kind of explain each of these a little bit. So there can be a little baseline of understanding, and then we'll talk a little bit more of gamification. So Kahoot, it is a trivial game that allows students to compete against each other based off of getting the correct answer to the question and how long it took them to answer that question correctly. Classcraft is a very in-depth version of gamification. It has everything from little avatars that represent the students. There's classes that the students can be, like mages, warriors, healers, and they work together in groups to earn experience points and better their character. And when I've used this in classes, I've seen more involvement because of that little digital character. They didn't want to see their digital character fail. There's also quests and boss battles. Quests are like little mini lessons that go through, and they have to go through step by step and complete little things to be able to achieve their end goal. And then there's boss battles, which are kind of like formative assessments that allow the students to be able to test their knowledge either individually, as groups, or as a whole class. The third one we're going to talk about is class badges. You can make little digital badges that you can send to students, saying that they've achieved a certain proficiency in different parts of your class, whether it be like strand 1, whatever it be. You can make these little digital badges to give out. There's Minecraft for education, which is like traditional Minecraft, but a teacher can limit the blocks that are used and demolition of buildings, things like that. And you can use it to really explore different things, from computing with redstone to architecture and engineering and building buildings, to even going through history lessons. I've seen teachers use one that was based off of like the Oregon Trail, and the students had to go through it just like the old Oregon Trail game. Nearpod, like what we're using, is an interactive PowerPoint presentation where they can be asked questions, they can draw, they can do different kind of resources and things like that. And we have some of these built into this demonstration, so you can see some of them as classic board games. I've used Monopoly in accounting. They had to keep track of the debits and credits as they went around the board and made money or lost money, bought things like that. My Kids Bank is a resource where you set up little checking accounts for the students, and you give them little deposits, and they can put money into their account. And then at the end of a quarter, things like that, I've done auctions, things like that. And then Quizzes is very much like Kahoot, except it's kind of a student's own pace, and they compete against each other for points and things like that. Did either of you two want to add anything to this slide before we move on?
I wanted to make a comment about my Kids Bank. Obviously, I have experience with Nearpod and Kahoot and some of those things. In making this presentation, we began looking at my Kids Bank, and I had the opportunity to go in and start setting up bank accounts and using those next year to integrate those in with our PBIS behavior plan, and then with our functional skills math group. So as I started looking at that, these are all really great resources that can easily be integrated in to help create that 21st century learner who is able to collaborate, to critically think, to be creative, and communicate with one another.
All right. So we're going to move on to an activity. I've started it for James and Brittany, and they're going to quickly draw their interpretation of what gamification is. And while they're doing this, I'll kind of explain some things. What's really cool about Nearpod is you can do these little activities for brain breaks, or so students don't sit there and just have to listen to lecture after lecture, things like that. You can also add, we're doing a live lesson as we go through this, but you can also do a student paced. And then as that goes on the teacher screen, like what you're seeing now, you can see all of the students' different drawings and things like that. That way there's the interaction of it as well for the students. So we have Brittany's drawing like a computer, it looks like, with a little thought bubble above it. Oh, she's adding some text. James is adding like a board game. You can zoom in, kind of like what I'm doing, so you can see them a little bit closer as they draw. All right, we'll give our students 10 more seconds to finish drawing. All right, and as you see, they can, once they've submitted it on their end, you'll see a submitted button, and then it'll finalize for them. All right, so we are going to move on, and Brittany is going to talk to us next.
Okay, so our next slide is about what purpose does this serve in education. And as we move to the next slide, we look at gamification to ideally help us facilitate three major things. Number one is student success. At the end of the day, we want to have clear objectives, and we want our students to be able to meet those objectives. We also want our students to be able to learn through experience, what I call experiential education, or what we could call play. We know that when students are able to learn while actively enjoying what it is they're doing, engagement is going to increase, and ideally so will retention of concepts. And then conceptual understanding, and that's just using gamification to make sure that students have a deep understanding of what is being taught, and the purpose would be to really get them to critically think through what those concepts are so that they can reach a higher level of understanding. Okay, and moving on to the, unless anybody else has anything that they wanted to add to that, let's go ahead and move on to our poll.
So this is another activity in Nearpod, and it's a poll where the students get to answer these questions. So in this case, it's gamification, an important new trend in education. And James and Brittany can go through and they can answer this. And so, as you can see, both of them said, yes, it is important as a new trend. All right. So some data about gamification. We pulled this from a website about trends and issues. And we found that videos are number one. They've increased. This is a 2015 poll versus 2012, but they increased quite a bit. And I think that's because more teachers are using things like YouTube and videos like that in the classroom. But games was the second highest increase in all of it, because we've been fighting students on using technology in the classroom, and now we're trying to use that technology, but in a creative manner that our students can understand it. And so Brittany's going to quickly talk to us about the cons of gamification in the classroom.
Okay, thank you. So like with anything, just as we are going to be introducing the pros, there are some setbacks with gamification, but with a proper understanding of the cons, I do feel that these can all be overcome. So the first con would be that some educators might think that gamification replaces instruction. And what we know with any type of technology that we implement in the classroom, an educator does need to be able to instruct their students through the technology, the content. And so gamification is not something that is the end all be all for instruction. And we need to remember that as we begin implementing these. Another con would be if a teacher had lack of training to integrate this. Like we have talked about through class, that students, part of technology integration is ensuring that students have teachers who are adequately trained in using this technology, or it will not serve the purpose that it is set out to do. And so we need to make sure that before using any of these, we are training our teachers. The third was the risk of superficial learning, which focuses on extrinsic motivation. And a lot of times with these games, because they are based on point systems or things of that sort, we might worry that it's extrinsically motivating instead of facilitating that intrinsic motivation, and that the learning is superficial because can you really, some may say, can you really critically think when you're gaming? And so I would say this comes back to point one, which is there has to be, and point four, games have to have clear objectives, and when using them, we must know what those clear objectives are. So for me, I think it's important that we keep these aspects at the forefront of our conversations before we just go and choose, say, oh, I want to play Minecraft with my students today. Educators must think through, the objective, and do they have the proper instruction, and can it lead to critical thinking eventually? Anybody else would like to add to that?
Not to the con.
Okay. So I'll pass that on to James then.
Thank you, Brittany. So our pros for gamification. Pros for gamification in classroom. Gamification is about teachers using game principles to make content more interesting for students and to get them to engage with the lesson. They are designed on the assumption that learning is maximized when high performance targets are set and teachers is focused on the individual. One frequent advantage of the endogenous connection between fantasy and skill is that the fantasy provides constructive feedback, meaning it's not going to be too high or too low. That's pretty vague. not just a right or wrong answer. It's helping the student with localizing, thinking about ZPD, zone for proximal development. It's not just, hey, you got it right, you got it wrong. It brings to life abstract topics such as set theory and logical reasoning, and makes learning more effective than ever. Also, modern students are more engaged in learning when technology is used in some form or another. To keep them engaged with the help of simulations and let them practice until they've become fully versed. A lot of times when you're in a classroom, there's only so many students. You're looking at the class average. I know it's no child left behind, but sometimes you have to form small groups later on to get that small group. But this is more for an individual. That's the benefit of technology and gamification. You can really hone in to specific students. Also, with increased motivation, we refer to users being more eager, interested, and engaged to deal with new technology as when teaching and learning content. And another thing with gaming technology, we're talking about augmented reality that we could put in the mix with that. And while AR technology is accompanied with higher acquisition costs, this investment is more likely to pay off in the long term. So there is initial investment, but the benefits weigh out the negatives. In this conclusion, I'm going to head back over to Justin.
All right. So in conclusion, I'm going to open this this activity up, and this is a kind of a message board kind of concept. So they're going to be adding their own personal feelings of gamification. So mine are: Justin feels that gamification can increase the amount of work that students give to the classes. When students believe they are playing, then they put more effort into what they are doing. Gamification, to me, is a necessary change. And I think the reason for that is we're trying to meet the students at their level. We're not trying to demean them by saying, you know, your level isn't good enough, you need to reach ours. We're trying to meet them at their level to begin with, to then help raise them up to new heights in their own personal education aspects. And then James and Brittany are finishing up their little thoughts about gamification. So James, you want to go ahead and read yours?
Yes, thank you, Justin. Gamification is a very effective way to introduce new content to students. It encourages the student to quickly accept new thoughts, ideas, and content.
And then Brittany?
Hey, excuse my spelling. I entered that pretty quickly. I am excited to implement more opportunities for gamification in the classroom. I have used both Nearpod and Kahoot, finding an increased engagement in the classroom. If done properly, this can be a great tool to increase engagement and gather data.
All right. And so lastly is our reference slide, which you can find in the presentation as well. Thank you all for listening to our presentation, and I hope you have a better understanding of what gamification is.